Thank you, Dr. Steve Fetter, and for spending time with us today. For the benefit of future viewers who might just be clicking in on this interview, I just say this is part of the Columbia Advanced Consortium on Complexity and Conflict and Cooperation at Columbia University. We, in 2025, established a project on the so-called megatons to megawatts agreement, which refers to a 1993-2013 deal that rid of 500 metric tons of highly enriched uranium from Russian nuclear weapons by diluting it and selling it to the United States for use in civil nuclear power plants. And the net result was ridding of 20,000 or more atomic bombs worth of weapons usable materials. The idea was originally proposed by MIT Stanford physicist Thomas Neff, but it built upon relations forged by academicians in the 1980s during the darker times of the US-Soviet relationship. And one of the questions in the background is, how did that come about? And what can we learn not only from the successful deal itself, but how this consequential cooperation was built and sustained. And we'll use the term HU deal and megatons to megawatts interchangeably. The presidents use the term HU deal, but the megatons to megawatts is kind of the more public metaphor of a swords to plowshares endeavor. Just a few words, high-level words about Steve's background. He's a physicist. He's a longtime professor at the University of Maryland since 1988, serving in multiple roles there, from being a dean and associate provost. He was an MIT undergrad in physics with the highest honors, and later a PhD at Berkeley in energy. That was in 1985. He has also worked at Lawrence Livermore Lab in the mid-'80s, postdocs at Harvard and Stanford. And in his spare time, he also worked at the State Department, Department of Defense, and later for 5 years at 2 tours in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I've had the good fortune to cross paths with him in a number of roles over the years. Enormous range of writings on technical areas of nuclear policy, missiles and climate over the past 45 years. And indeed, it was kind of a course in itself, Steve, just to go through your Vita with publications going back to 1981 at least. And there'll be a link in the video, next to the video on our webpage, that will go to the CV with more details about all the papers you published and awards and so forth. Again, before starting the interview proper, at a very high level, just sort of paint some of the possible areas we might talk about. You were directly involved with some interactions with the Soviets in the 1980s, such as the 1989 Black Sea experiment, which I've been intrigued to learn more about in preparing for this interview. Some very interesting adventures there, and potentially any insights you have on the building of relationships before that 1989 event. Would be interested in your insights and experience with, on the U.S. side, John Holdren, a Stanford physicist, later MIT and elsewhere, Frank von Hippel, Ernie Moniz, Tom Neff, physicists all. On the Soviet side, you've obviously had interactions with Roald Sagdayev and Velikov and others who played important roles in these building blocks for cooperation in the 80s, as well as, to my later surprise, Velikov was actually instrumental in important ways in some of the initial surfacings of the ideas for the HU deal. And then your involvement at the cusp of the HU deal, you were sort of at the State Department in 92. It turns out we may have even crossed paths in the hallway because I was there before I went over to energy. And then you were at the Department of Defense with physicist Ash Carter, later Secretary of Defense, and building the Nunn-Lugar federal government counterpart in some respects to the HEU deal, which was more market driven. Um, and then would, as Andrea mentioned, um, some of your later service on science and OSTP, some of the broader lessons you might derive from that. So, with all that as preface, another question I have to ask you is, how did you become a physicist? Because it was intriguing on your CV. You mentioned that you were the first in your family and from Central Pennsylvania to graduate from high school, and then like 4 years later, you're the first in your class at MIT. So, like in physics. So, how did you get interested, and what was the inspiration for that? If I
Well,
may
I think it was partly luck, but
ask.
what was important is having just one or two teachers who take an interest. I think that's true for many people. In my case, it was my fifth grade teacher,
Wow.
Mrs. Marjorie Baker, who I think would see that I was a little bored, and she gave me her college textbook in astronomy. It was
Wow.
probably an astronomy for poets course, but for me, it just seemed incredibly advanced. And from that moment on, I wanted to be an astrophysicist. You know, all these unsolved problems about the origin and nature of the universe, and I also was fortunate because my parents uh, didn't really, well, they did not only not go to college or graduate from high school, they just had no idea how you got in, how you paid for it. But in high school, I had friends whose parents were encouraging, and I said, when one asked about my interests, they said, "Well, you should go to MIT. You should apply to MIT." So I was lucky enough to get in. And there just met all sorts of interesting people. I mean, I really was focused on physics, but one of the interesting things about MIT was a lot of the physics faculty were engaged in policy problems. There were many former Manhattan Project scientists like Bernard Feld, Bernie Feld, Philip Morris, and Vicky Weisskopf, and Henry Kendall. He wasn't a Manhattan Project scientist, but he was co-founder of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Their first issue was anti-ballistic missile systems. The second issue was reactor safety. And I grew up just not far from the 3 Mile Island reactor. And MIT was really a hotbed of activity because the chair of the nuclear engineering department, Norm Rasmussen, had just completed the reactor safety report. Completed that report just a year or two before the accident at 3 Mile Island. And so Henry Kendall, who then became my thesis advisor at MIT, my undergraduate thesis advisor, he was really one of the um, key critics of the method of analyzing safety. So I had all these role models,
Hmm.
including, I should mention, Kostas, who another physicist at MIT, who around that time was doing early work on missile defenses, including particle beam weapons. And this was before
Right.
SDI, you know,
I
was
remember that he had a book called Arsenal.
yes, yeah. It was.
Hmm.
I still use it as a textbook for
Uh-huh. It's got the red
students.
cover on it. I can picture it.
Right.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I mean, that's a remarkably young age to know what you want to do. I believe there's a reference to Einstein being fascinated by a compass and just the mysteries of like what is these forces that are, moving the compass. And I guess you had a similar kind of a epiphany looking at the astronomy.
Yeah, I built telescopes. I got books from the library on how to, because we didn't have any money, I ground my own mirrors for
Wow,
a
wow.
telescope, and I was
Like
pretty much
Spinoza.
outside every night. I was not much of a social person. Also grew up in the countryside. Never learned how to drive a car or had a car. So I spent a lot of time gazing up at the sky.
Wow.
Also was an amateur radio operator. So when it was cloudy, I could sit and listen to people on the other side of the country or the world.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, it often just it comes down to having, just a couple teachers and it can changes
Yeah.
your life. And um, well, if I may then, turning to the sort of the pre-HEU deal timeframe and some building some of these bridges of cooperation. Do you recall some of your first interactions with the Soviet academicians? I don't know, maybe it was the Black Sea experiment in '89, or maybe you had some experiences before that. I don't know.
Well, some of my mentors had earlier experiences. So John Holdren, who was my PhD advisor,
Ah,
he had been engaged with Velikov on fusion from the 1970s. And so
oh,
John would tell me about that. I didn't have any personal experience until probably it was 1987, I'm thinking, when the Federation of American Scientists, led by Jeremy Stone, but I think who was CEO, but Frank von Hippel probably was the president at the time. He was invited, and Frank would have all the details on this. And if you haven't seen his memoir, it's all written in his memoir. But I think as part of Gorbachev's effort to, some people refer to it as a peace initiative or a peace, he was trying to find a way to engage the Reagan administration
right,
in arms control negotiations to ratchet down, the pressure uh, on the Soviet Union to keep up with the arms race, the arms buildup that was well underway by the Reagan administration at that time, and had made several overtures. And I think it was probably Velikov, some combination of Velikov and Sagdayev, identified the Federation of American Scientists as an interlocutor. The title Federation of American Scientists sounds
right.
very high and lofty, like almost like a National Academy of Sciences, but really it was just this small operation. But Jeremy Stone, very entrepreneurial, and again, they would have all the details, but I think they outlined kind of an agenda, ideas to explore, and then I was recruited as, one of the people who would actually do some of the technical research on things like, well, in the START negotiations, as I recall, one issue on the Soviet side was whether sea launched cruise missiles should be included in the limits. And the US position was no, that verification was impossible. Because you could not count weapons that were deployed on a ship. And so
Right.
that raised the issue of, well, can you detect a nuclear weapon? If someone says there are no nuclear weapons on this ship, can you confirm that that's the case? Or if they say all the nuclear weapons are here, there's no others, could you detect it? And so I think that was one of the first projects that I became engaged with. And, there were, of course, others later. But I was, pretty young at the time. I think, let's see, I would have been about 20, 26. I was either finishing up a postdoc at Harvard or then I started at Maryland in 1988. So around in that time frame. Um, and
Mhm.
Frank would arrange meetings with Soviet scientists. There were meetings both in the United States and in Russia. So I think I traveled for the first time to the Soviet Union, to Moscow in 1988. But I believe there were meetings before that.
Hmm.
And they were rather, technically focused. And it was just a terrific opportunity. And, I should say at the time, I just was too young to realize what a special time this was uh, in history, but also what a unique opportunity it was for me. I was sort of maybe a little too matter of fact about it all.
It was you remind me. I remember being in Moscow in 1988 for the purposes of the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, which was in Schultz and Shevardnadze had signed it in the Rose Garden, and so we were working to implement it. And it was a little bit jarring to kind of you had Gorbachev, Glasnost, but yet it was we were arrived in November with the celebrations for the revolution, and so there's these big banners in Red Square for of Lenin and and Stalin. So you had this sort of two eras that hadn't quite dealt with each other yet, and it was hard to reorient one's own thinking to what changes might happen. But anyway, that's a
Well, and
but
I'm glad I got to experience the old Soviet Union, at least a
mhm,
little
mhm.
bit. And I've sometimes joked that, like, we have an old Sturbridge village or a colonial Jamestown where you can see what it was kind of what it was like with the clothes people wore and the jobs they had. There really should be a Soviet version of this where you can experience.
Lenin's tomb.
Well, I'm thinking, going into stores. I just remember wandering around Moscow and going into grocery stores where there would be nothing on the shelf, or certainly nothing you would want to buy.
Right.
Long lines. I remember joining a line, and when I finally got to the front, it was just bars of soap, things like that. It really left an
Revelatory.
impression, and I think anybody and there must be people who romanticize that, oh, things were better in the old days. It would be nice if that were somehow preserved.
Mhm, mhm. So from what you've said, even before the 1989 Black Sea experiment, you were already interacting with some of the Soviet academicians that sort of Frank and perhaps Tom had sort of helped organize.
Yeah,
Um,
particularly Sagdayev. And
Sergeyev.
Sagdayev was the director of the Space Institute of IKI, and he had two or three people on his staff. Stan Rodionov, Oleg Prilutsky, and another one who on the Russian side were kind of my counterparts, the people who would do the technical analysis.
Right, right. And I mean they were academicians, but I think some of them also had ties into the weapons complex as well. So they were kind of maybe dual-headed a little bit. Um,
I
or
think that came later.
okay.
I'm trying to think, and probably also more through Tom Cochran, who was working, I think, with Velikov to do things like um, establish the seismic monitoring equipment
Right, right.
at the test site. So I was not engaged with that directly.
Okay.
Tom had gotten some seismologists to work on that and to buy the equipment.
Yeah,
But the Black Sea experiment was kind of a follow-on to
right,
these demonstrations.
right, right. Yeah, we interviewed Tom and he did cover that. And so I was just sort of probing your interactions with the Russians before
Hmm.
the Soviets before the Black Sea experiment, which you were definitely directly involved in. I don't know if you care to say anything about that. As again, I was kind of astounded by this image and some stuff that I read about you and perhaps Tom, like climbing up on this Slickum missile launcher on the Slava, the boat out in the middle of the Black Sea, and doing gamma ray detection on it. It's just a wonderful image of kind of like the end of Doctor Strangelove. You're straddling this missile.
Right. Yahoo! No. Um, Again, I wish I could go back in time and kind of remind myself or give a nudge to the young Steve Fetter that, this is really a very special thing
So,
that you're doing.
your kids didn't know you were Indiana Jones.
But yeah, I would say I was maybe rather too matter of fact about it. Just I did all the calculations, learned how to use the detector and the multi-channel analyzer, and I wrote my own codes to take the spectrum and find the peaks and correlate them with isotopes, and actually grew out of my PhD research, which was on the doses from various radionuclides. So I, knew how to identify gamma ray lines, correlate them with isotopes, determine the composition of materials.
Right, right. Well, that was, I believe, because of Velikov's initiative. the experiment went forward based on his own kind of um, bold step, but then there was back pressure right near the timing of your measurements, and
Yes.
they were going to limit your time to like 10 minutes. And I believe that somehow you and Tom fooled them into 24.
Well, it was 5 minutes was the limit, and there were people from Arzimas, from the nuclear weapon laboratory, maybe also the Chelyabinsk lab,
Right.
and they did not approve of this measurement for
Keratin
obvious
himself, I
reasons.
think, was opposed.
I'm sorry, who?
The Keratin, the
Oh yeah, yeah.
Artemis 16 had,
But Gorbachev overruled. He said, you know, that they were going to go ahead with this, and it was a pretty dramatic demonstration of transparency. And even, almost equally, or perhaps in some ways more transparent, that experiment was followed then with a trip to the production site at Chelyabinsk, the, plutonium production reactors, to the radar, the ABM radar at
mhm.
Krasnoyarsk. So this was really, part of a broader peace offensive by Gorbachev that I think was effective in changing people's views, changing views in the United States about the willingness of the Soviet Union to engage in serious arms control verification. Because, historically, verification, especially on site inspection, had always been a non starter for the Soviets. And so this was really dramatic opening. And I particularly remember that several of the scientists that I met, the weapons scientists, I mean, this was the first time they had ever met an American. This was really a big deal for
Right, right.
them. And there were opportunities to kind of chat informally. I don't remember any,
Sure.
significant exchanges just beyond the fact that they were, I think they were rather stunned by this dramatic opening.
Do you think that they knew that you had spent a year at Livermore? I mean, did that kind of burnish your credentials in their eyes too?
I,
Besides, he's not just a physicist, he's been, you know, a Livermore guy.
I am assuming that they had, that they briefed their people
Hmm, hmm.
on our backgrounds. Of course, we were a non-government group, so we did not have any of that support. And that turned out, I think, to be important later.
Now, on this Black Sea follow-up adventure at Chelyabinsk and radars and the like, I think if I recall correctly, um, Cochrane and others helped invite congressmen along as well. And so there was not only Gorbachev was demonstrating openness, but I think there was an effort to kind of show congressmen what the demonstration was and take that news
Yes, yeah, I think
back.
Congressman Spratt,
Oh,
who
he was Armed Services. Yeah.
Armed Services Committee,
In the
and
House.
a second Congressman, Farr, I'm not
Yeah, I
sure.
don't.
There were two reporters, Bill Broad from the New York Times and Jeffrey Smith from the Washington Post, who covered the story.
Interesting. I'll come back to. I remember Smith was at the December 91 meeting too, because I remember reading a press piece about one of the follow-on meetings to the one in October 91. Um, but before leaving the Black Sea adventure, I so you definitely met Velikov on that.
Oh
He's
yes, yeah.
yeah, and so you saw him in action and the like, and so
He's one
um,
of these larger than life characters, you know.
yeah, there was an interview with you and Frank von Hippel and Tom, and I think Tom said about Velikov, he's my hero, which was interesting. Um, I've met him a few times as well over the years, and so I have my own favorable impressions of him. Um, and so, yeah, in fact, there was uh, a report about a picnic afterwards too. I don't know
Yes.
anything.
Well, if you haven't heard Jeffrey Lewis's interview, I think it's called Skinny Dipping in the USSR.
I did see that. I think
Yeah,
Cochran skinny dipped,
right.
but no congressman.
I don't think so. I think they were wise.
Okay, we won't. I won't ask you that question. Um, was Chris Payne there, by the way? Because we want to interview
Yeah, I
Chris.
think so. Yeah,
Um, he was, I believe, working for Senator Kennedy then,
he was. Yeah.
and so you had these interesting ties back to House Armed Services and then Senator Kennedy and so forth. It was an interesting array of.
Hmm.
Um, um, so so now, having demonstrated the kind of bona fides of of this experiment, I believe the first workshop of NRDC and the Federation for American Scientists was in 1990, and then one particularly relevant for the megatons to megawatts deal was in October 1991. I don't know, in Washington, uh, and I don't know if you um, had the opportunity to attend that meeting or not, if you recall.
I think so. I'm very bad on dates,
Okay,
but
well,
I probably would have been invited to every every meeting.
okay, yeah. I know you were at the following meeting we'll get to in December because there's a presentation on your CV from you and Tom on the verification transparency. But um, yeah, I was just wondering if there were any recollections about Mikhailov, because that was the meeting where Mikhailov came to town. He was then like first deputy minister of what was then known as MAPI, but it was pre-Manhattan, if you will.
Hmm.
Um, and it was in the hallway there that Tom Neff, um, pitched his idea to Mikhailov that was soon to be published in the New York Times in October 1991 on the HEU deal. So I don't know if you have any recollections of when you first either met Neff, physicist Neff, or physicist minister Mikhailov or not. But
No, I mean I of course remember both. It's hard to
not,
forget Mikhailov, the sort of chain smoking Mikhailov. Um, but I remember early discussions of the HEU deal among the U.S. group of a possible, HEU deal, and discussions of presenting this to the Russians. But I don't remember, and I can't remember if I was there.
we'll ask Chris Payne may have some of these records, but it's interesting. I mean, I think that's the October meeting. Chris Payne wrote up, and it was published in, I think, in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a review of that meeting at which the HU deal was discussed,
Mhm.
and that probably would have been the earliest occasion for it to be discussed. Um, and Mikhailov didn't make that many appearances in the U.S. in that time period. So anyway, there's a high likelihood that you were part of that.
I'm pretty sure
Um,
though that there were earlier discussions, earlier meetings just of the US group
in
where
preparation.
yeah,
Hmm.
and
No, that makes
I'm
sense.
sure Tom wrote a paper that he presented and that we discussed.
Yeah, he gave a two-pager to Mikhailov, or a three-pager that elaborated on the the op-ed. So that may have been sort of what was shared
Mhm.
with a larger group. So that proposal was written when the Soviet Union was still kind of rocking on its last legs. But then there's a meeting in December, which you and Tom Cochrane, to distinguish our Toms, Neffs, and Cochranes, you and Tom Cochrane gave a presentation in Moscow of the same FAS NRDC group. And it's at the same time that the Soviet Union is kind of coming undone. Do you recall what it was like being at Moscow at the end of the Soviet Union?
Well, in fact, we were in Kiev the day that Ukraine became an independent country. I remember toasting with,
Hmm.
uh, you know, sparkling wine. the birth of this new country. And again, I wish I knew at the time how momentous this all was. It was all very interesting, and I remember there's a great deal of excitement and optimism, particularly in this sphere, in the area of nuclear arms control. It really just seemed like everything was possible, that this was going to be a new era. And I suppose that feeling continued for another 6 or 7 or 8 years.
Hmm.
And as you know, then it became an official activity. There was lots of lab to lab engagements. There was the cooperative threat reduction program, which then made a lot of these activities or engaged US government officials, lab scientists in these discussions. But at that time, I think this is just still the H.W. Bush administration, it was largely a non-government activity. At least everything that I did, or, Frank or Tom, that was all a non-government activity on our part. But,
Right, right. It did in this partly perhaps as a outgrowth of the Velikov, Cochrane, von Hippel efforts on the seismic testing in that there came out of that the joint verification experiment,
mhm.
which was sort of some of the earliest involvement of the DOE national labs, weapons labs with Mikhailov, for example, in the joint verification experiment in Nevada and in
Yeah.
Kazakhstan and Nevada. And I I think it that in some of Mikhailov's recollections and musings, that was a time when he met the U.S. weapons scientists and spent time in Nevada, and it sort of made him rethink, like, he's on the targeting committee in the Soviet Union, but here are the people at the other end of it. And it was the sense of camaraderie, competitive camaraderie in the interactions on the JVE that perhaps without which you wouldn't have some of those other programs like the MPCNA, the lab to lab that
Yeah.
emerged in the early Clinton period.
Yes, do you remember when the JVE occurred?
It, it was 1988, and I believe it was completed by 89.
Yeah.
And and so and again, amazingly, who is there in both in Kazakhstan uh, and in Nevada is Velikov, and
Yes.
he's elected like the mayor of Nevada temporarily. He's got the
I didn't know.
and
I just did recall, though, at these later meetings, maybe in 1990, the one you're referring to, was it 1990 or 1991 in Moscow?
the,
There,
the December 1991, the one
yes.
Right before Kiev. Then I think the trip segued over to Kiev.
So there were some lab observers. There were um, at least one, maybe two people. They were observers. And I can't even remember their names. They never said anything, but they were at the table or maybe in the back row just to hear what was going on.
I think it may have been on a Dan Fenstermeyer website or something. I think Carson Mark was at the Washington October meeting, who was the former head of the
Right. But
theoretical division.
I mean a current weapons scientist
Ah, okay.
was there, but I can't remember his name. I just remember he wasn't very happy with me.
He must have been from Los Alamos then, if you were. It's just on principle. Um,
Well, one of the things, of course, we were investigating or trying to discuss was whether you could verify the dismantling of a nuclear warhead, whether you could tell that something was a warhead, whether you could verifiably dismantle it, whether you could tell that a nuclear weapon component, a pit, or a secondary can subassembly, whether those came from nuclear weapons. So this was, part of the discussion at that time.
well, I happen to have the title of the paper that you and Tom presented at that meeting was Verifying the Authenticity of Nuclear Warheads Without Revealing Sensitive Design Information. And
Right. Yes.
And so
That turns
apparently,
out to be very difficult. So, as you know, there was the template approach and the attribute approach were, both discussed. I was always more attracted to the template approach because, you really could be highly confident that, especially if you use the gamma ray signature, that this component matched a previous component, which perhaps you had high confidence came from a nuclear weapon. But then the problem was that template had a lot of information embedded in it. And how could you protect that information? How could you compare the measurement with the template and protect the sensitive design information?
and you'd have to have people crawling over ships reciprocally and stuff. And
Right, right.
before we leave the Black Sea experiment entirely, wasn't there there was an associated Soviet neutron-based detector that was more removed from the weapon that had some benefit
Yes.
of what.
They had a big helium-3 neutron detector in a helicopter that could easily detect the nuclear weapon um, on the ship from, I forget exactly,
I
maybe
think like
about 100
75
meters.
meters or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, flying over, which I think they had developed that equipment so that they could monitor the presence of nuclear weapons on U.S. ships, perhaps as they sailed through the Dardanelles or other straits.
Right, right. Yeah, I think there was someone who was skeptical that the U.S. Navy would ever let them get that close, but I guess there were examples of like the
Yeah.
group just waving at the overflights.
Well, and there are some interesting cases in Sweden too that you may know of where Soviet subs uh, got very close and too close to the Sweden, and the Swedes used neutron detectors to detect the presence of nuclear weapons on those
The,
subs.
the Guyuk Gap, I think it was
Yeah.
acronym for. Um, how did I was reading through the tables of contents of all the science and global security issues this morning, and it's a fascinating publication. I didn't realize how threaded you are throughout it from issue number one. My first reasons for going to it were reading some early pieces by Neff on the HEU agreement and Oleg Bukharin and later Jim Timby. Um, but when I noticed you had this publications with Sagdayev in like 1990, I was just even trying to think operationally, how did that work? Like we didn't have like the emails and
No,
the faxes. I mean, like, do you just like call and talk on the phone, or
no,
was
we
one?
had email.
Okay,
Yeah, and I think I work mostly with the staff at EKI, the people I mentioned before, who I think were co-authors, Stanislav Rodionov, Oleg Perlutsky. I'm pretty sure that we used email
okay,
to send drafts back and forth. I might be wrong about that, but
yeah, no, it was. I
because there
guess it was
was
email.
there was cooperation, space cooperation, I think from between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So there probably were open channels of communication.
Just mentioning space cooperation reminds me that well, first you had Velikov proposing fusion circa 1986 to Gorbachev and Mitterrand, and it happened, and
That's why
um,
we have ITER.
that's why we have ITER. It's got we may get fusion other ways, but then the next when the and space cooperation, um,
I should say
one
space science.
well then more taking space science to space cooperation, when Velikov um, reading declassified presidential memcons of the um, Camp David 1992, first time February, Yeltsin and Bush 41 meet. Um, Velikov is with Yeltsin because Mikhailov is sort of between, he's not appointed minister yet, and Velikov has all this summit experience. And according to the records, Velikov had a one-pager on space cooperation that he shows to Yeltsin on the helicopter from the White House on the way to Camp David. And upon arrival, Yeltsin, with Velikov at his side, just says he hands it to Bush and says, he basically has his endorsement for the space cooperation, US USSR, and then Bush hands it to Scowcroft. And then in their meeting, Yeltsin pitches the HEU deal to
Hmm.
President Bush, and there's some back and forth, and Velikov, is supporting of it. So anyway, it's just astounding, these kind of big initiatives, and big initiatives don't always work out exactly as they plan. Like
Hmm.
they take longer, like the ITER. But other ones, they do come to fruition and they do have lasting impacts. So
And both of those led to really important assistance for uh, the Soviet Union and then Russia. Um, and they provided things that were of value to the United States.
mhm, mhm. So if we turn now to the cusp of 93, 94, and so you've gone from the State Department over to the Department of Defense and working for Ash Carter, who was part of um, in the whole time frame of 92 to get the Nunn-Lugar passed. I mean, there was a report, Harvard report, Carter Perry briefing the Congress, getting
Mhm.
support. So now he's in office and he's got responsibility for helping kind of a Russia that doesn't have all the capability it needs to secure its materials. Do you have any recollections from that, from the standpoint of your work with Carter and being at the Department of Defense?
Well, I was mostly working on other issues.
Okay.
Say my title was special assistant, which can mean lots of things, but in my case, it meant I basically did whatever Ash wanted me to do at the moment, which was
Hmm.
for. I was fortunate that that was usually the hot item, of the time,
Hmm.
and so that was mostly North Korea. Later, it was the nuclear posture review. And I think it was Gloria Duffy who mostly had the cooperative threat reduction portfolio, but
Hmm.
occasionally I would, be drawn into discussions of particular issues. But I did not do a lot of work myself on nuclear material security or the disposition of nuclear materials, although I was aware of what was
Hmm.
going on. And in fact, I think had attended meetings earlier about plutonium disposition. Um, and I had favored the blend. What was it called? You
Right,
blend it with waste and geological disposal of the
right, right.
plutonium.
Yeah. Um,
I do remember visiting the Kurchatov Institute. Oh, what year would this have been? And being struck by the level of security at the facility. Um, I recall there was a portal detector, but because we were distinguished visitors, we were waved around the portal. We went inside this building, and I remember seeing quite a bit of HEU in the form of little discs that looked
right.
like washers. I don't recall that they had markings on them.
They were probably from Obninsk, the Obninsk discs.
Okay, but I don't think they had any, unique identifiers on them. And I had the impression that I could have put a handful of this in my pocket and walked out. And I remember uh, the fence, the weeds were growing up along the fence.
Right.
And this is, suburban Moscow where there are lots of people around. And it was just I had worked at Livermore where we had a plutonium facility with an extremely high level of security where there were armed guards, where they regularly had exercises, to protect the plutonium. And so I do remember on at least that one visit being struck by the low levels of material security and the need to do something about that.
Right. That was the first facility in it was in early 94, um, based on, well, there were analyses of the types of vegetation and so forth that you were describing from satellite images, was trying to look at like where the where's the HEU and plutonium and what might the vulnerabilities be kind of at the from the literally the 30,000 foot level. And then and most of them are in the hinterlands, but the thing about Kurchatov was it's like you say, it's in Moscow and it's headed by Velikov and Ponomarev Stepnoy, his loyal deputy. And so the first Charles Charlie Curtis, um, then undersecretary, later deputy secretary and acting secretary of energy, um, went to the Kurchatov Institute, and with Velikov and others' help, they invited all um, Minatom labs and production facilities to come to Kurchatov, and then the labs demonstrated some ways that they could use technology to secure the material that no longer had watchers
Yeah.
over it. And it started out, I think, a reprogrammed $2 million to put on this problem. And it was the demonstration at Kurchatov that I think it made the sale at the other facilities that, hey, these are reasonable people. They've got technical solutions. It could be a pathway to scientific cooperation. And so that's when the budget for MPCNA started to go from 2 million to 15 to 100, 200 million at from one. So yeah, the Kurchatov was the proving ground for
Mhm.
MPCNA in the first instance.
I do also recall the early discussions of a plutonium storage facility or a pit storage facility with Mikhailov.
Right.
I do remember Mikhailov saying, "If you just send me $400 million, I will get it built. Here's the bank account number. You should send the $400 million to." It was a, you know, long discussion after that.
Yeah, I remember Charlie Curtis went to a meeting with Ash Carter and Mikhailov, and Mikhailov, the report was, I mean, he had a time urgency problem, and that in order to ironically live up to the arms control agreements that had been fashioned under Bush 41, um, they were downloading all these warheads and they didn't have a place to put it. And like the Army Corps of Engineers had their ways that they would build facilities, and you have to have like the, the right kind of drains by the side of the road and stuff. And so yeah, Mikhailov just wanted to get the money on the problem in Russia a lot cheaper. He actually, I was intrigued when I was putting together my book manuscript on this, that he actually proposed of putting up more HEU as collateral outside the HEU agreement in order to, so like if the funding wasn't right or whatever, just, you can get yourself paid back. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, it was, so that was a sort of intriguing thing that I wish I had paid more attention to at the time. But in the end, I think Charlie Curtis offered to put up the money to have the labs do some of the early construction contract and take it out of the DoD's hands with their permission.
Right.
But it's a challenge to work through bureaucracy on one side, let alone two. But I was curious if you obviously knew Frank von Hippel by this time, and John Holdren. I wasn't part of the administration at this juncture, but he was sort of leading the National Academy of Sciences study on plutonium disposition.
Hmm.
Um, their study was published, I think, January 1994, and Matt Bunn became the executive director of that. I don't know if you just sort of followed that intellectually while you were dealing with your day job in the Pentagon, or if you kind of ever, interacted with the network of your your buddies from the 80s.
Well, I think I, perhaps along with Dick Garwin, wrote or gave some presentations on plutonium disposition at an earlier time. So we certainly aware of this, of the issue of the options and, the need for a careful study of this. Although I'm, was pretty sure what the answer should be. Of course, there are big uncertainties about costs and about time frame. Um, but let's, if you haven't spoken with John Holdren yet, he would, of course, be a good person to speak to, particularly about Velikov, because his connection to Velikov goes back to the early 1970s.
Right.
You mentioned the fusion cooperation. That really was some of the earliest scientific cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union was in fusion. And I think that goes back to the Eisenhower years, to the first test ban talks and the Atoms for Peace speech when the US declassified fusion research.
Hmm.
But I think John, he met Velikov at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, and was a co-author of a joint study
Oh,
on
wow.
fusion and breeder fission. It was, I think that might have been the title of the study, you know, like fusion or fast breeder fission, which is the best. So John knew Velikov for a long time through the fusion connection. And
Interesting.
Sagdayev too later, because, you know, Sagdayev was a very accomplished plasma physicist, very well known. So it was that plasma physics connection for John. And then John was chair of CSAC, but then also he was a member of Clinton's PCAS, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology.
Where Ernie Moniz was part of that too.
Right. Yeah, Ernie was my quantum mechanics professor also. It was, I think, the only physics course I ever got a B in. But um, so a lot of the same characters are present in the story for, you know,
Yeah.
several decades.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the fascination of it because in my manuscript, I was just sort of intrigued to learn at various levels of detail along the way that at Stanford in physics, von Hippel was there as a professor. You had graduate students, Holdren, Moniz, Neff,
Yeah.
Tinby, Meserve, and then all later in their own responsible ways um, having, having these important roles in public policy as well as their academic careers. And so these network effects, um, both within the U.S. as well as you've just pointed out, have these sort of rich effects across nations as well, in some under some conditions. With Holdren, to pick up on your point about that long relationship with Holdren and Velikov, they they had there was like a Holdren Velikov commission, it was called, in the mid 90s that was trying to bridge the gap between the Russians' reluctance to disposition plutonium in
Hmm.
through MOX runs and the U.S. was the only place the Venn diagrams crossed were on MOX fuel in that manner,
Right.
and if the U.S. paid for it. So I mean, it was again part of this sort of bridging activity to try to fulfill this addressing the clear and present danger of plutonium.
Right.
Um,
Which then led to our, you know, ill-fated decision to go both routes in the United States.
right, and then we threw away the 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 downblend and with high level waste approach somewhere later, and then we lost the original plan too.
Right, right, and wasted billions of dollars on the MOX plant, and now because to save, you know, that we're trying to adapt it to a pit production facility, probably spending more money to adapt it than we would have spent if we started fresh.
Do you have any? I mean, with the HU deal, it got rid of roughly a, a third of the planet's weapons usable material. I mean, what do we do about the plutonium dilemma in the long run? I mean, I guess it's got the civil plutonium is almost more worrisome on scale these days than the weapons plutonium, as you say, at least in the U.S. You know, it's under pretty tight security. Um, I mean,
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is let's not produce any more. So,
right.
you know, the French and Japan are still producing or planning to produce more, which is foolish, not having any plan to use the plutonium that they're. So what's the expression? If you're in a hole, stop digging.
Right, right. That seems Ernie always he often used that. I think it must be an MIT physicist thing.
Right. And then, I don't see any economically attractive use of the plutonium. That's something that Matt Munn and I, spent a time showing that the economic case for MOX is very weak and likely to remain very weak for as long into the future as we can see, almost, regardless of what happens with the growth of nuclear power. It will be cheaper to make low enriched uranium than it
Right.
will be to make MOX fuel, even if the plutonium is free. And so that's what, led me to the conclusion that we should, well, of course, the first priority is safe storage, but then we should blend it with waste and dispose of it and in a geologic repository.
Immobilization is the word for that, I think. That was
Yes,
the one I
immobilization and
was
right.
the shorthand senior moment. Um, what about you, you've thought about this, you've written about the role of science in policy. We've been talking a lot about scientific relationships that, kind of help scientific collaboration helps lead to policy innovation. You've looked at this in OSTP about kind of the the two sides of the same coin, policy for science, science for policy. I don't know if you have any kind of in less than 10 minutes, um, you've got any thoughts on that, or if that's just too big a
Well, it
item
is
to
a
take
big.
on.
I do teach a course on it, but that's a whole
It takes
semester. I always say it's vital that all policy be informed by the best available science, scientific information and analysis. But I know that it's not going to be determined by that scientific analysis. It's just one factor, and there are lots of other factors, economics and politics and equity considerations and international relations. And sometimes you do things that don't make any sense um, because you have relationships with other countries that you're trying to facilitate. So ITER, is one of those cases. I've never thought ITER made any sense to put so much money into that one concept that if you want to explore, if you want to strive toward fusion energy as a practical solution for energy supply, climate change mitigation, you need something that is competitive, economically competitive with other sources. And tokamaks are never going to be the case. But it was a way of facilitating cooperation, within the Soviet Union and now with with the other countries of of, advancing the science. Very inefficient way of doing it, but so
Sometimes you just have to start somewhere.
right, and it would be different every issue that you look at. Space. We mentioned space science or space exploration. I personally do not think it makes much sense to put humans in space, and particularly not on other planets. But if you're going to do it, it makes sense, I think, to cooperate, with other countries and to try to do it in a way that is at least, makes the most sense or technical sense.
If just reflecting back on the megatons to megawatts experience and um, how the cooperation was sustained, do you have any sort of more general thoughts about, cooperation? Um, you apparently have a role in the doomsday clock, and are you optimistic going forward, or
I think you have to be optimistic. So I always answer this by saying I have children, I have grandchildren. I think we have no choice, but to be optimistic and work towards solutions. It would just, I couldn't accept being fatalistic about our ability to, we created these problems, we created the weapons. In the case of climate change, we created the technologies that put the CO2 in the atmosphere. And I do think we are clever enough. I don't think it's a, scientific or technical problem. It's mostly a social and political problem. But that's what I think we have to work on.
Well, thank
And
you so much for your time,
it's a
Steve.
wonderful way to close the this is perfect. So we are very grateful.
Well, thank you for
Yeah,
the
well,
opportunity.
yeah, we could definitely go on longer, but thank you for your time that you've taken out of your busy schedule, and it's been, um, yeah, a great pleasure to work with you over the years, and your sort of calm demeanor, but calm and thoughtful, and independent. You know, you've studied reactors and their risks. You've also recognized the potential role in climate change, and so you let the verdict fall where the science says. And so, anyway, thank you for your time and your thoughts.